Join Rick Hartley, Susie Webb, Stephen Chavez, Chuck Corley, Karen Burnham, Thomas Chester, and Charlene McCauley as the electronics industry's leading experts gather at PCB West 2025. Coming September 30th to October 3rd to the Santa Clara, California Convention Center. PCB West features more than 125 hours of in-depth electronics engineering training spread over more than 50 sessions, including 30 brand new classes. Sponsored by the Printed Circuit Engineering Association, PCB West features classes for every level of experience, from novice to expert. Registration is open at pcbwest.com. Don't miss PCB West 2025. Engineering tomorrow's electronics.
Hello and welcome to PCB Chat, where we talk with experts across the printed circuit design, manufacturing, and electronic supply chain fields. I'm Mike Buetow, the president of the PCEA. Today's guest is David Schild. David is Executive Director of the Printed Circuit Board Association of America, also known as the PCBAA. The PCBAA's mission is to promote and support U.S. production of PCBs and the electronic supply chain in general, primarily through coordinating its members' voices at the legislative level. Today we're going to talk about PCBAA's recent annual meeting in Washington, what David is hearing from Congress about legislation supporting the PCB industry, and maybe a few other thoughts as well. Thanks for joining us again, David.
It's always great to be here. Thanks, Mike.
I know many in DC feel whipsawed by what feels like never-ending changes in policy on Ukraine, tariffs, immigration, industrial policy, and so forth. How are you hanging in there?
Well, we are living in interesting times. I wouldn't have it any other way because, as you said, there is a lot of change, administration to administration. We are seeing a different approach from the White House, from the Commerce Department, from the Department of Defense regarding industrial policy. But here's what's important, Mike. We still believe in industrial policy in this country. The outcomes are a shared goal of both parties. We want to build more things in America. We want to reduce our dependency on foreign sourcing. I don't think that the goals have changed. I think the tactics have changed. And while that makes people nervous and uncomfortable, we would be in far worse a spot, I think, if the disposition in Washington is what it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, which was a very laissez-faire attitude about America's manufacturing sector and a belief that if things have gone overseas, there's no strategic implications to that. There's no geopolitical consequences to that. Well, we know that to be false. And further, we understand that it hasn't just all been driven by market forces. We know now that foreign governments have subsidized, have invested, have made multi-decade plans to own these verticals, these technology sectors. And now you saw it with the Chips and Sciences Act, and you're seeing it with other programs. There's a recognition in Washington that there are reasons to do industrial policy. So I welcome new tactics, and we will respond accordingly. But I'm glad that the wind is still blowing in the right direction.
Okay, well, I want to pick up on that a little bit more in our conversation, but let's start with your annual meeting. So PCBAA held its annual meeting last month in Washington, D.C., and as part of it, you sponsored a defense microelectronics supply chain panel with key DoD prime contractors such as Raytheon, Lockheed, and Northrop Grumman. What was the goal of that panel, and what issues did you cover?
Well, we wanted to connect the ultimate customer for so many people in microelectronics manufacturing and in the PCB industry specifically with the folks, in the room. And so I'm grateful that companies like Raytheon, which is one of our OEM members now, were able to participate. And this was a Chatham rules kind of day, so I can't get into too many specifics, but I'll tell you what some of the sentiments were. They were, hey, we don't want to have single points of failure in our supply chain. We are getting a lot of pressure from the Pentagon and the administration to innovate, to invent the future and deliver that. And we recognize that you are a critical supplier and you're a critical industry for defense and aerospace primes. And I think that every company shares that view. That's why so many of them have executives who are solely responsible for printed circuit boards, for IC substrates, for a lot of the microelectronics that go into some of these marquee defense programs. And so for representatives of those companies to sit up on stage and say, here's what we're hearing from the Pentagon, here's what we're hearing from the White House, here's what we're hearing from Congress, here are the goals that we've set for ourselves in terms of new technologies, in terms of the factories that are going to come online, and here's what we need from you. It's a really important conversation. Again, we are all rowing in the same direction, but it's nice to actually put the key people in the room so they can have those discussions.
So let's talk a little bit more about the annual meeting in general. What takeaways did you get from the membership and perhaps any congressional meetings that you held during that? It was a 3-day meeting, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of key takeaways. The first is that there is an expanded ecosystem out there now that cares about this. When we started with 5 companies, we were primarily large board shops, and we have grown to include critical material suppliers. We've grown to include tooling and specialty minerals and materials folks. We now include several members of the EMS space as well. And so what I think you're seeing now is a recognition that the semiconductor industry got well organized and reaped the rewards of organized efforts in Washington. Now, up and down the microelectronics supply chain, short of chips, because chips don't float, we have a similar common purpose. And so I was really impressed to look across that room and see a diversity that certainly was not there when we were founded 4 years ago. Now, in terms of our interactions on Capitol Hill, it's a different and it's a changed political environment, right? We have a very narrowly divided House and Senate. I don't think there is an appetite for as much direct government funding, but there is, if anything, an increased focus on competition with China and a desire to remove risks from our supply chain. And so we heard from a lot of members, talk to me about incentives, talk to me about partnerships at the state, local, and federal level. What are you going to bring to the table if the government's going to bring money to the table as well? But I didn't hear you're on your own. I didn't hear we've moved on from this issue. If anything, we still are in the educate part of our educate, advocate, and legislate mission. And by that, I mean, we don't have universal recognition of what printed circuit boards and IC substrates are. We don't have a clear understanding amongst all the key players in Washington about the nature of the problem, a problem 30, 40 years old at this point, right, Mike? So I still think, even in our 4th year, we are meeting staffers and members of Congress who for the first time are hearing, in your state, in your district, this key technology was invented, is manufactured, is delivered to key customers, but we are facing a lot of stiff competition, not from foreign companies, but from foreign governments. We've got to do the educate part first, and then I think we get to advocate and legislate.
Well, you're right. This has been a long conversation that's been taking place going back even to when the U.S. was in a prime position worldwide, with 30% or so of the global market share in PCBs. It was a $10 billion plus industry. We were neck and neck with Japan. We had complete leadership in high multi-layer count boards. And back then we were just trying to get recognition and some depreciation laws adjusted, right? So that we could keep buying. Today things are very different, and the environment is much more threatening, I think, in many respects, both that we're coming at it as an industry from a smaller negotiation point, right? We're a smaller industry than we were, but we're perhaps more critical than ever because the capacity is strained. And I want to get to that in a moment. But I do want to ask, so these are some of the tactics, though, that you were alluding to in terms of working as much at the local level and things like that. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think what we are seeing is that, we heard from, for example, we heard from Pentagon and officials at the Department of Commerce, and they both said, we are not walking away for support for American manufacturing, but we are going to take a different approach than the Biden administration necessarily took. And so I know that there are going to be follow-on visits from those executive agencies. They're going to be going out to PCB factories based on some of the relationships that were formed at our annual meeting. And Mike, can you think of a better way to educate somebody at the Commerce Department about what it is that microelectronics truly mean besides walking them through a factory, right? It's a learning experience. It's a light bulb moment, for so many key officials. And so that's one of the reasons we have this meeting, is to connect our manufacturers with key policymakers and then do those follow-on visits. I mean, I'm also thrilled to announce that there will be a number of congressional representatives going into their districts during the August recess to visit PCB factories, to visit EMS locations. And so, this educational tour It is going to be months and years of work, and a lot of it started at the annual meeting. I think we are open to dialogue and conversation about what tactics are available besides that direct infusion of cash, right? And of course, we always think that grant programs, because they're such small scale for our industry, right? They're not $52 billion, right? Tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, even low billions, would make such a difference for the printed circuit board industry. We don't have the cost to build a chip fab, right, that Intel or TSMC is looking at. So we also have to be direct, right, with lawmakers about how big we are, about what's required, and about the fact that right now we lack that critical demand signal. I mean, I think that was something that we said a number of times in our meetings on and off Capitol Hill was, we can't go to Wall Street right now as an industry and say, we need investment, we need capital, we want to build a new facility, hire new workers, we want to expand our footprint, because we don't have a great answer to the question, where is the customer? That's why our tax credit, right? That's why the tax credit portion of HR 3597, the Protecting Circuit Boards and Substrates Act, is so important, because it's a demand side tax credit. It's a Buy America tax credit. If you are selling boards, right, you can say to your customer, I can make you competitive with Asia now with a tax credit that the U.S. government is offering. Now you can go to the investment community, right? Now you can go to Wall Street and say, here's where my customer is going to be. And there are some other tactics, Mike, that we can talk about in terms of generating that demand signal. But that is really an important component of our legislative push.
Well, you're right. There's fewer publicly traded companies in the printed circuit fabrication and assembly today than there have been at any point in my 35-year career, at least in North America. So yes, private equity has made up some of that gap, but we don't have companies going public. There is certainly a different relationship today with bankers than there was 20, 30 years ago. You really need a broad financial picture, I think, in order to have a growth industry. I do want to ask, do you plan to do any more of the microelectronic supply chain panels around the country, or is that going to be a one-off?
Well, the response was overwhelmingly positive. And so what I would say is it's definitely going to be a part of our annual meeting going forward. I mean, certainly, we are talking to a lot of OEMs and they all have similar concerns. I also think you're going to see more convenings like that in the think tank space amongst some of the other folks who bring people together inside and outside of Washington, because now there's a recognition of how valuable those conversations are. So the short answer is no, this is not the last time we're going to assemble a group like this.
Now, I imagine you're getting a lot of phone calls about tariffs. What's your sense there? And does the PCBAA have any position on that?
Well, we haven't taken a position yet. With our partners at GEA, we're definitely looking at the impact of the potential tariffs that have been announced on August 1st. Of course, now we're considering tariffs on EU goods, on goods from Japan, as well as a tariff on copper. And we're in information gathering mode, like I think everybody is at this point. These announcements are fairly recent. The ground is shifting very quickly on the subject of tariffs. And so the most important thing we can do is accurately assess what we think the industry impact will be, and then very clearly, right, not with a political bias, but just stating the facts, communicate with key policymakers what those impacts are going to be. And this is something that literally I'm working hour to hour, day to day, as we get closer and closer to August 1st. So I hope that the next time we talk, we'll have a better sense. But of course, we've been through this several times in the last few months.
And for listeners who aren't familiar, GEA is?
Formerly IPC, but now the Global Electronics Association.
We can count, I guess, as a win, the decision we have an outside investor who purchased a Denkai America copper foil plant, and we'll keep that open.
Yeah, that is a huge win. I toured the facility in South Carolina last year with their member of Congress. We discussed the critical nature of, the refined copper foil product that they produce. And of course, we were all very dismayed when Denkai announced that they were going to cease operations. It's really great that they have been reconstituted as Camden Copper. I think it shows an incredible amount of strategic thinking by PMC, the company that went ahead and acquired them, and by leaders in Washington who supported that move. And I think we are thrilled that Camden Copper remains a member of PCBAA because they serve this very unique function. And I think now you've got, a great team in place that understands their role in the national security ecosystem, I'm certain their domestic customers are thrilled that they remain in operation. And so that's a good news story, right? Where we were very close to having a single point of failure actually fail. But fortunately, I think some strategic thinkers came in and saved the day. And I think it's a good template for other places in microelectronics manufacturing where we're only one or two bankruptcies, failures, closures, layoffs away from not having a domestic source. But when you start to ask the hard questions, what does this mean for critical applications? What does it mean for the defense industrial base? Then I think the choice becomes clear about what has to be done.
Ukraine and Israel get the headlines, but per many reports, the U.S. lacks the capacity needed for a supply chain capable of, and this is a euphemism, high volume engagement. Is that message resonating in Congress right now? And if so, and you mentioned there are several scheduled visits by legislators to various factories around the U.S. coming up. Do they almost have to be visiting the munition stores as well in order to really get a full picture of what's going on?
One of the things that we try to do, Mike, when we make these arguments is not just talk about, the green boards themselves, whatever size or shape they might be, but their end use applications, right? And I say this respectfully to all of our members. I don't know that people are as focused on the number of layers, right? How the traces are laid out, what chemicals, you're using. I think what they're focused on is, does this power a Columbia-class submarine, a B-21 Raider, a Javelin missile system? Because those are the products that we're all so familiar with. And when I say we, I mean policymakers in Washington who hold the power of the purse. So we always coach up and work with our members to get to that end-use application. Of course, there are high-end defense and commercial applications. I do think lawmakers understand that. And now that we've got the buy-in of so many OEMs, including some who are members of PCBAA, I think the message is being communicated even more clearly. But if I was standing next to a member of Congress and we were standing in front of a PCB production line, that's what I would probably do. I would probably invoke that helicopter, that submarine, that munition system and say, it doesn't work without the microelectronics that make it smart, that make it cutting edge.
The tagline, and you mentioned this, chips don't float, is, in my opinion, brilliantly elegant because it captures the entirety of the situation in 3 short words. Semiconductors, of course, have owned the public's imagination ever since the Intel Inside campaign in the 1990s. That campaign almost single-handedly commoditized the PC. Fast forward to today, the Biden administration made the CHIPS Act a cornerstone of its industrial policy. Yet Congress, my take, seems lukewarm about maintaining it. If semi is tied to Biden, then would the PCB industry be better off going alone, especially if you consider that the global PCB industry is roughly the same size as TSMC?
What's interesting is there's certainly a political affiliation for the CHIPS Act because it was one of the signature programs, not just of President Biden, but also of Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo. But if you look at where construction is happening, if you look at where factories are actually rising, those are critical battleground states. And I don't see anybody on either side of the aisle who is a naysayer about new chip fabs coming online. There's criticism of the process and how we got there. But the idea of increasing capacity and growing our domestic industrial base, I don't see either political party combating that. The chances of a CHIPS 2.0 are reduced if you define CHIPS 1.0 as a Biden program. I think that's a fair political assessment. But what I'm also hearing from the White House, from the DoD, from the Commerce Department is we are not walking away from American manufacturing. If anything, you see the president really revels in celebrating announcements of capital investments inside the United States across a variety of sectors. He loves to stand up there and say 100 billion, 500 billion is coming back to North Carolina, Ohio, New York, wherever it might be. Well, we have the potential to serve up some of those announcements for sure, right? The PCB industry wants to grow and wants to expand domestically. So I don't find us at cross purposes with either political party. I think it's just a shift in tactics, but the goal remains the same.
In your opinion, the after effects of failed companies like Solyndra, which kind of came to symbolize the U.S. investment in solar panels, the aftershocks of that are no longer resonating, or is there still some fear of failure that might hold back investment in what we see as a critical industry, but Washington may not recognize it as such?
I think there's two things, right? There is, of course, a significant threat of fiscal conservatism in Washington now that is probably more powerful than it was 2 years ago. And that is affecting everyone's spending, not just the money that we might spend on microelectronics investments. I also think, Mike, that there is a bipartisan recognition of the threat from foreign dependency and dependency, specifically on mainland China, right? 60% of our boards coming from that location. There is a recognition in the private sector that China plus one is a real and necessary strategy, that foreign dependency is a bad place for us to be for any number of national and economic security reasons. And I don't think those are facts that are in dispute. I mean, look at what's going on with shipbuilding and the federal initiative right now, led by folks like Senator Todd Young from Indiana, to recapitalize America's shipbuilding base. What is that in direct response to? China's ability to outmanufacture us and have many times our output in terms of ship capabilities. So, that's something that's just popped off here, I think, in the last 6 weeks. I think there is still a desire to compete and win on the global stage and to not be dependent on foreign sourcing. That's what we really need to focus on. Yes, at times, government investments have failed. But right now, the strategic imperative to do this is very real. It's inarguable. And the third thing I would say, Mike, is we're the only ones who aren't going to be doing it. There is a gold rush going on right now following the Chips and Science Act. If you look at what the Thai government, the Vietnamese government, the Indian government is doing to incentivize electronics manufacturing specifically, it's very, very real. They want to be the plus one in the China plus one strategy. And what I've been saying in Washington is, if we're not careful, China plus one won't mean America. It won't mean the United States. It will mean other foreign sourcing. And look, Mike, I need to say this as always. We're going to have a global supply chain. We're going to have a diversity of sourcing. What we don't want is single points of failure. We don't want dependencies in places that are also adversarial. So let's manufacture all over the world and have it include the United States, Europe, the greater Americas, other allied locations in Asia. There's enough for all of us here, but right now the concentration, I think, is in the wrong place.
You've been working on the Hill for more than 20 years, right?
Correct.
Yeah. How does this administration and Congress compare in terms of the ability to hear and respond to an industry's message?
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on. We have a very narrowly divided government, and it means that the number of bills passed into law is severely reduced. Certainly, within the lifetime that I've lived in Washington, we don't see as many legislative vehicles moving forward. We've gotten away from what's called regular order, where those 13 appropriations bills stem from the president's budget and then are passed into law one after one. We saw what's called a CR, continuing resolution, last year. That's no way to run the government. I think there's a bipartisan agreement on that. I'm a little dismayed by the lack of productivity from the Congress. However, I also think that there is now, again, a shared bipartisan belief in we've got to have industrial policy and we've got to have the ability for America to compete on the world stage, right? 5, 10, 15 years ago, when you saw capital going overseas, when you saw manufacturing going overseas, when you saw jobs going overseas, and the eviscerative effect, the really difficult effect that had on so many communities in the United States, there were a lot of folks in Washington who said, look, this is the market at work. We're just not going to make things anymore in America. I think that view has largely left. So while I'm frustrated with the slow pace of legislative progress and while I am frustrated that narrowly divided government acts much slower and is more difficult to partner with, I'm encouraged by this sentiment. I think the wind is still in our sails on industrial policy. I mean, how many years back was the sort of idea behind the Chips and Sciences Act? I mean, now it's like 6 or 7 years, right? It's not done. These issues are still at the forefront. And I would just say to that point, now is the time to act. There will be a moment when the bright, shiny object in front of the Congress is not building things, is not bringing factories online, owning technology sectors. So we need to strike now while there is focus and while there is consensus.
Now, you mentioned upcoming legislation. And of course, all eyes will be on the fiscal 2026 budget. Any hints as to what that might look like insofar as microelectronics?
Well, unfortunately, the news on that front is not good. It does not appear that the budget submission as offered will fund the accounts that have given out Defense Production Act or DPA dollars in the past. And so there's a joint effort between PCBAA and GEA to go to the Hill and go to the Pentagon and to raise that this is a very real concern. I mean, we have, Mike, as you know, factories coming online, facilities that are expanding, specifically in like the UHDI space, due to Defense Production Act dollars. It was a win to get microelectronics like boards and substrates placed on the DPA list. It was a win to have hundreds of millions of dollars sent out the door. We did the budget process a little bit backwards this year, but when we look inside what we call the J books, the justification documents, we're not seeing the signs that the Pentagon is preserving those accounts and funding them. So there's a battle raging right now to make sure that those interests are looked after. And I think the number one issue is this. You can't have two things happening simultaneously. The first is report after report out of the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, and the White House saying America needs to make more microelectronics. We need to lead in microelectronics R&D. We need to make sure that the way that we serve the defense industrial base is trusted, is secure, is resilient. And then on the other hand, fail to fund the accounts that would result in that outcome. So all we are asking for, I think, at this point as an industry is live up to your statements and continue to disperse a modicum of money that makes such a difference for our folks.
In the conversations that you had at your annual meeting and elsewhere, to what extent did workforce development and just talent availability and allocation come up? And, I get it really kind of works into sort of a larger question almost of immigration, right? Either we need to find the talent onshore or we need to be able to bring in folks who have the skilled labor that we need to work in these factories if they are going to scale up. How does this conversation play out on Washington?
It always comes up as a part of the and then what equation. If we make these investments, if we get the tax credits we want, if trade and tariff policy are where we want them to be, who will work in these factories of the future, right? There's going to be a certain amount of automation, but of course we're going to need all the engineers. We're going to need all the design work. We're still going to need a lot of high touch labor. And so it's one of the hardest challenges that we face. And what I say about this is it's not a challenge that, for example, the GEAs and the PCBAs of the world have to tackle independently, right? There is an entire discussion now in Washington about if we're going to be a nation that manufactures more, where are the manufacturers themselves going to come from, right? An increased emphasis on trade schools, a refocusing of what a lot of four-year universities are outputting in terms of their technical talent. And everybody I talk to, whether it's in semiconductor manufacturing, PCB manufacturing, whether it's in warehousing and logistics, whether it's in electric vehicles, anything, there's always this discussion of where are we going to get the workers from? And so I wouldn't say it's our singular focus, but it comes up as a part of every discussion. And we did get some smart questions, for example, from the Commerce Department on that front.
This week, you posted a statement saying, a decade ago, no one would have imagined a $52 billion federal investment in semiconductors. But today, chip fabs are rising all over America. This must not be the end of our reshoring effort. And I love this next line, David. We cannot allow a failure of imagination to limit our nation's industrial policy. Congress and the administration can finish the fight and invest in the rest of the technology stack. Now in your third year in this role, I feel like you're really finding your voice and becoming more assertive. Does it feel that way to you?
I appreciate that very much, Mike. And yes, I think as we grow as an organization that I'm fortunate to lead at this time with folks like Shane Whiteside, with folks like Will Marsh, we are finding our voice, and I think we are finding reception to that voice in Washington. I was actually testifying before the U.S.-China Security Review Commission at the beginning of June, right around the time of our annual meeting. We were invited to speak to that group about Chinese dominance in critical sectors because the word is getting out that microelectronics have to be part of the equation. And when I made that social media post, I was really referring to what we talked about earlier, the change that anyone who has been in Washington now over several decades will have seen from an attitude that, look, the global market economy will take care of itself. And all we will see is a shift in what Americans do for a living and how capital is allocated to, I think, a recognition that some of the consequences of global trade were not what we would have hoped. And that is because other nations leaned into their industrial policy. And I said this in front of the commission, and I'll say it to you again. American microelectronics companies are not competing against foreign companies. They are competing against foreign governments. That is not a level playing field. That is not a free marketplace. If another country is willing to build you the factory and lease it back at $1, pave the roads, put in the utilities, subsidize worker housing, and underwrite very, very cheap pricing on electronics goods, for example, that's not the free and fair flow of commerce. And I think there's a recognition that efforts to own certain technology verticals resulted in industrial policies by other countries, while Congress largely said, hands off. We don't pick winners and losers. No one's trying to pick winners and losers. We're just asking for a fair competition on the global stage. And we're pointing out, Mike, the consequences if it's unfair. They're very real. We saw this during COVID, right? All of a sudden, Americans can't get F-150s. Right? Because we don't have the semiconductors that power them, and those trucks are waiting at the ports. We saw that during the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, guess what? From F-150s to F-35s, everything needs a printed circuit board. So let's not recreate that situation at scale, a foreign dependency that threatens our economic well-being, threatens our national security. So when I talk about a failure of imagination, it's believing that this is possible because it's been done. In the last few years, real industrial policy has been done. And now there are factories rising in places that you never would have expected, major announcements of investments on our shores. I think that the business community and Wall Street are looking to the federal government. And I say this as sort of like private action follows public policy. When Uncle Sam says, I am the ultimate guarantor of this technology, boy, capital moves, right? People get off the sidelines. And so now we need that for the rest of the microelectronics stack.
So in other words, the government's industrial policy becomes the driver. That's the investment thesis.
Absolutely. You know, the real important number, I think, when you talk about the Chips and Sciences Act, is not the $52 billion, right? Much of which has been invested and is bearing fruit. It is the $460 billion plus in private investment. And the reason that is there is because the government acted first and signaled that this was a national priority. And it removes a lot of the uncertainty and it removes a lot of the risk. And so I am confident that there is private money sitting on the sidelines that a lot of folks in the microelectronics ecosystem outside of chips could take advantage of. But those investors, they need that signal from Washington, from Uncle Sam. And we're pushing them to send it.
So the messages that I'm taking away are that the goals are consistent. They're the same. New tactics are in place. We're looking at continuing to increase the pressure on Congress, but perhaps educate, not condemn, and strongly encourage them to recognize where the single points of failure are and take measures to avoid them. Fair summary?
Yeah, absolutely. The core of our educate, advocate, and legislate mission has not changed. We just have more voices at the table. And I'm confident that the next time we talk, more success stories in Washington and an even larger team to talk to you about.
Terrific. Folks who want to get in touch with David can reach out to him through the PCBAA. David, do you want to give your email address and or the website?
Sure. Find us all the time at pcbaa.org or on LinkedIn or Twitter.
And I suspect that you would encourage folks who might have a little bit of time free during the August recess to reach out to you and see if you can help coordinate with some congressional visits as well.
Absolutely. It is a short turn to get that done. But what I would say to anybody, your member of Congress is likely at home and in the district in the month of August. They would love to walk through a manufacturing facility. If PCBAA can help make that happen for you, I want to talk to you soon.
Thanks, David. Our guest today has been David Schild, the Executive Director of the Printed Circuit Board Association of America. Have a great summer, David, and we'll see you at PCB West in Santa Clara in October.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you, Mike.
For PCB Chat, this is Mike Buetow. Have a nice day.